Hi, everybody. Eric Draitser from Counterpunch. Been a while since I was able to do one of these videos, so apologies for my absence. If you want discussion, explanation of where I've been, what I've been up to, and what accounts for the last couple of months of me not being around, then you can check out Counterpunch Radio. Hopefully, in the coming days, there's going to be a discussion, probably by tomorrow, actually. There's going to be a discussion up there with me and Joshua Frank, managing editor of Counterpunch, discussing various issues about what's gone on with me and so forth. But this is absolutely not the time to talk about me because I have gotten on video here this morning, or actually this afternoon, to talk about what's going on in Palestine as obviously the main issue, the main topic of discussion for so many of us for the last week, or actually probably about 2 weeks now. So I don't think I need to recap all of the various events for people. If you're a counterpuncher, then you are already following the issues. You already know. Last week, I put out a brief conversation I had with Ramzi Baroud talking about some of the critical issues related to Gaza and the Israeli war against Gaza, the ongoing war against Palestinians in general. So you can go over to the podcast and listen to that conversation. Ramsey is always worth paying attention to. Now, I wanted to just record here for a few minutes, just some of my thoughts, partially because I would like to memorialize them since I haven't been around in months. And I wanted to make sure that I got a statement out here, but I also wanted to talk about some of the issues that I think are relevant and hopefully people will be thinking about as they engage with some of the coverage of what's going on in Gaza and Palestine broadly. And specifically, I mean, mainstream media coverage and some of the language that they've used, some of the ways in which they have presented the recent events, and why we need to question those narratives, question that framing, question the language, and also delve a little bit into some of the history. Obviously, I'm not going to give a history lesson of the last 75 years here, but I do think it's worth pointing out just some of the relevant points because, as we all know, and I'm not going to monologue too much about the media, but as we all know, the corporate press, the mainstream media, whatever you want to call it, does as much misinforming as it does informing. It peddles as much misinformation as it does good information. Plenty of great articles in the New York Times, lots of misinformation in the New York Times as well, and that is true for any publication, all the TV outlets, etc. And that is probably no more true than in the context of the conflict over Palestine and what's gone on in recent days. So I'm going to get into that. Right now, I want to just begin by saying what is patently obvious, I think, to all of us, but certainly not discussed in the corporate press, and that is the nature of the Israeli mission against Gaza, right? Because the idea that is put forward most popularly, and this is straight out of the Israeli talking points and the IDF propaganda centers, and that is that the Israelis are going to invade Gaza for the purposes of permanently wiping out Hamas. Now, Hamas is often sort of the bogeyman that is used to try to invalidate or to undermine not only Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation, an occupation that's been going on for 8 decades, but also as a sort of means of invalidating and undermining any form of criticism and skepticism of Israeli quote unquote facts, Israeli truths. So when they talk about Hamas, it's often in response to the justified anger at Israeli treatment of Palestinians. Well, what about Hamas? But they use human shields, they use children, they place their weapons here. All of this is deflection. And this is the most important point that I could say at the outset, is that you cannot allow Israeli propagandists, Israelis and their various propagandists in the United States and around the world, you cannot allow them to frame the discussion in this way, to deflect away from Israeli crimes by pointing to Hamas atrocities or suicide bombers 25 years ago or whatever the case was. This is the standard tactic that they've always used. In this case, they're going to point to the pictures and the videos of all the horrible things that had happened with the initial Hamas incursion of a couple of weeks ago, or I guess 10 days ago, or whatever date that was. I'm recording on October 17th, so I've lost track of which days. But anyway, they'll point to that atrocity and then the Israeli response to that atrocity in isolation, without context. And they will use Hamas's actions in order to justify not just future actions, but actually retroactively justify all of their previous crimes. And that is something that really needs to be thought about a little bit more carefully. Why is it that we don't accept these kinds of equivalencies in other scenarios, Russia, Ukraine, for example, or point to any other example of conflicts, Colombia, Venezuela, or any other example, right? We don't allow such equivalencies to justify criminality, do we? We don't allow a false equivalence to then justify Colombian death squads attacking the Venezuelan border, or whatever the example might be. In the context of Palestine, however, for whatever reason, such equivalencies are allowed. They're okay. Zionist propaganda will always tell you of all sorts of atrocities committed against Jews by Palestinians or committed against Israelis, not Jews broadly and specifically Israelis. They'll tell you all about it as a way of justifying all of their crimes. So let's talk about what crimes led to this point. Because in any situation, context matters. The mainstream press doesn't care about context. They want you to come away from this thinking Israel's the victim, Palestinians are the aggressor, and that's that. But there's a lot more to it than that, right? Sure, you might even see CNN or whichever, quasi-liberal-ish outlets might talk about the sort of the siege against Gaza, what's happening in Gaza. They may make mention of those things, but it's always couched within the righteous sort of retaliatory strike by the Israelis against an initial sin committed by the Palestinians. In this case, we know what that is. This is what we're talking about when they remove the context. So let's talk about some of the context of this. The context is such that Gaza has essentially been under siege for at least 2 decades. Okay, Gaza is really under siege now. The electricity, the energy, the food, water, medical supplies, all of that has been totally cut off. But in fact, Gaza was under a pretty similar, mostly similar siege going back at least to the 2000s. If we recall the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, the Israeli settler withdrawal, quote unquote, from Gaza, allowed the Israelis to implement a crushing siege. Now, when I talk about a siege here, I really do mean they controlled Gaza in 360 degrees. They controlled all of the entry points. They controlled the flow of goods and all of the rest of that. So when we talk about Gaza, we talk about a multi-decade humanitarian crisis, one in which you have, well, obviously permanently displaced people who have been displaced since 1948, but you also have, just in more recent years, untold thousands of children who have died or become ill or permanently injured because of a lack of medicine, because of a lack of nutrition, because of a lack of access to clean drinking water. You have whole segments of the Gaza economy completely decimated by the Israeli stealing of their water resources in the context of agriculture, or in many other industries and various other trades that are simply impossible in Gaza because the Israelis control the flow in and out. And they have, going back, as I said, at least a couple decades now. You have a kind of what I know Ramsey has talked about, and others as well, a slow genocidal campaign. And when I say a slow genocidal campaign, I really do mean that. Genocide in the true sense of the word, an attempt to eradicate the people themselves, not just the people as human beings, but a people that exists in the world. Palestinians cannot exist. They must be erased. Why? Well, according to the Zionist propaganda, Palestinians aren't real anyway. They're Egyptians, they're Jordanians, they're Syrians, they're whatever they are. They're not Palestinians because Palestine never existed. Palestinians don't exist, and Palestinian rights don't exist. This is part of the mindset that breeds the kind of crimes Israel is perpetrating and will continue to perpetrate. Palestinians have no right to live because they don't exist. That's a fundamental concept that is embedded in Zionism. Maybe not all walks of Zionism. Maybe we might make distinctions between some liberal forms of Zionism, and I don't care to do so, to be honest with you, because all forms of Zionism and whatever political guise it decides to emerge, all forms of Zionism are forms of settler colonialism, and all forms justify an apartheid state carrying out genocide. So it really, to me, doesn't make too much of a difference. Now, from a political perspective, obviously it does. If we're talking about internal Israeli politics, which I may get to here in a minute, drop my phone, whatever. But in terms of the broader issues here, especially from a sort of moral perspective, ethical perspective, these political shades of gray within Zionism don't matter all that much. What matters is understanding that Zionism seeks not simply the land, it seeks the eradication of Palestinians as a people. And this takes many forms, and all of which are documented. It takes the form of the stealing of Palestinian geography, the replacing of their place names with Israeli names, the replacing of their literal physical buildings, stealing homes and whole neighborhoods, renaming them, sometimes destroying them, demolishing them to the ground, and so forth. We've all seen these videos. We all know what I'm saying is true. The United Nations has documented it from top to bottom. So there is no real dispute here. This is part of the slow genocide, the replacing, the erasure of Palestinians. This is part of it. It is also, you can find it in culture and food. The Israelis have, not only adopted Palestinian foods and Palestinian cultural traditions and so forth, but in fact, they have attempted to appropriate them as their own to the exclusion of Palestinians. Not, oh, we moved to this land and we adopted some of the customs of the people who live here. No, these are our customs. You don't have any right to them. That is, at least to a large degree, where the Israeli mentality is when it comes to that. The same is true for their history. I already mentioned Israeli propaganda says there is no Palestine, never was, never will be. Oh, sure, yes, there was the British mandate, but there was no Palestine. It didn't technically exist. There was no Palestine prior to that. There will be no Palestine in the future. Palestinians made up. Right, this is from time immemorial, was a famous right-wing Zionist book, which inculcated a lot of these ideas in some of the right-wing conservatives, certainly the neocons that emerged in the 1970s, I guess, and really took force with the Reagan administration in the 1980s. So a lot of these ideas, they are rooted in a lot of this Zionist disinformation. And I could point to a number of other examples of this kind of creeping genocide, slow genocide. And one that I think is worth pointing out as well is the fact that the quote unquote invasion of Israel by Hamas was not really so much an invasion of Israel as it was a invasion of land that had been illegally seized by Israel and then repopulated with Israelis, contravening international law, contravening the 1948 armistice agreement, and so forth. In other words, even the initial attack by Hamas is sort of distorted through the lens of mainstream media, corporate press, and as well as Israel's propaganda. So, I mean, I could go on for like an hour just talking about the various aspects of this creeping genocide, slow genocide that is now accelerating. The Israelis feel that they now have carte blanche. They had their quote unquote their 9/11. Right. And just as 9/11 justified the unjustifiable criminal wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and many other crimes committed by the United States, so too do the Israelis feel they now have their carte blanche to do what they've always wanted to do vis-a-vis Gaza and the Palestinians. And in fact, there was a statement by one of the Israeli ministers, I think it was the defense minister, but I could be wrong, in which he basically said what they've all said many times before, and what's so mundane is almost not to even be reported in the press, and that is, what are the Palestinians complaining about? There's all this empty land in the Sinai Peninsula for them to live on. Yeah, what are you complaining about? I just kicked in the door of your house, burned your house to the ground, and hey, there's a tent over there you can live in. This is the logic of the Israeli propaganda machine, and of course, of all of their little foot soldiers in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere. All right, I want to talk a little bit about the siege of Gaza, because as I already mentioned, the notion that Gaza is under siege, I think, is something of a misnomer, at least insofar as Gaza's been under siege. It's now under a more intense siege, one that seems to be a precursor to a horrendous war crime that's about to unfold. But nonetheless, Gaza's been under siege for quite a long time. Shall we add to the death toll all of those children and elderly people and people with treatable diseases and others that have died since the Israelis imposed their siege on Gaza like 20 years ago? Should they be included in the death tolls? I think they should. Should we also start talking about the number of children with irreversible conditions and developmental delays and other things because they didn't have access to medicine, because they didn't have access to drinking water, clean drinking water, because they didn't have access to proper nutrition at the most critical ages? They should also be considered victims of all of this, but they don't exist in the mainstream narrative. Only in places like Counterpunch and another alternative press on the left will you hear discussion of these vital issues. You might actually hear it if you read to like page 600 of a UN report or something, but most people aren't going to do that. Now, I'm past 15 minutes, so I really need to kind of try to be a little bit concise here if I can. I want to quickly mention Israeli politics plays into this as well. And it's not just politics, Israeli society as a whole. Part of the reason why the Israelis are essentially able to carry out what they're carrying out and what they're about to carry out is because they have the consent of the population in that country. And what does that tell us? Consent to carry out genocide. What does that tell you about a society? It tells you that the society has long since been fascistized. It's long since turned into a fascist apartheid society. It's not just, and this is important, it is not just as a political regime. It is not just as a political entity or as a state that it is apartheid and genocidal. It is at its very core transformed into a true fascist society, one that views all Palestinians as subhuman, as not really worthy of the right to live, let alone the right to live in peace and comfort, to be able to feed their children and all of these things. They don't have those rights. And the fact that the mainstream, the vast majority of Israeli society, in poll after poll, seems to reflect this view of the Palestinians, this is what allows the Netanyahu government to carry out what it's about to carry out. It is not because they simply make a political choice. It is because they have the consent of the people. Not all, of course, not all, but to a large degree, they do. And this then should, it won't, obviously, in mainstream discussion, but in our corner of the world, it should raise the question, raise the discussion of what is Israeli society? What happens to an entire nation of people when they view their quote unquote enemies as subhumans? Well, we have plenty of examples throughout history, none of which are pleasant if you're a Jewish person. Think about being a Jewish person outside of Israel and having to look at the cold, hard reality of the fact that the Israeli state and that the Israeli society behaves much more like Nazi Germany than it does like any democratic and peace-loving nation. So when you have to reckon with that, it's very difficult. And I can speak as somebody who is not religious, but raised with in a Jewish background with pro-Zionist talking points inculcated into me from a very, very young age. It was a long process of unlearning a lot of things. And one of the things that had to be unlearned was that Palestinians are human beings. deserving of all the same rights as every other human being. That is a critical aspect of this. I don't want to get sidetracked here. I was trying to talk about Israeli political life too. The fascistization of Israeli society has also, as you might imagine, been reflected in Israeli politics, which have moved further and further to the right over recent decades. There was a time not long ago where socialists were able to openly engage in politics and to be able to build political blocks and so forth. Now, I don't want to get into socialist Zionism and all of that stuff. I just mean to say that within the Israeli context, there used to be something of a left, and there used to be something of a coherent left liberal center, right? Most of that is gone now. And Israeli politics has shifted so far to the right that absolute Nazis like the Kahanists and others who are openly genocide advocates, they're now in the mainstream of Israeli politics, where they used to be fringe crazies. And now the fringe crazies are just the right. The right is the center. The center is now quote unquote the left, and the left is gone. Right. And we've seen that reflected in other countries as well. The United States actually has seen something like that as well. But in Israel, it is particularly pronounced. And having that fascist political culture that's combined with a fascist social norm, I think that creates the sort of the cocktail that we see in the form of the modern Israel, an Israel that is in many ways even politically indistinguishable from the Israel that came 30 years earlier. Right now, we should be fair to say that the signs have always been there, and in fact, you could make an argument that today's Israel is just the logical culmination of the ideological premises of Zionism, and I wouldn't argue with you. But it is still true that Israeli politics has shifted far to the right. And those right-wing sort of genocide advocates, they are now in policy positions, and they're the ones carrying forward this attack. Now, the attack itself is obviously designed to basically wipe out the Palestinians. It is not designed to wipe out Hamas. The Israelis know they can't actually do that. The only way they can wipe out Hamas is by wiping out the Palestinians. They're not going to be sending Israelis into every underground tunnel. They're not going to be fighting door to door. They're going to carpet bomb the place and try to kick as many people out and never let them return. This is the idea. It is, in a sense, kind of similar to some of what happened in 1948, but obviously drastically different for all the reasons that I don't have time to go into now. I want to make a couple of other points. Israeli propaganda is very, very important because there was a time when you couldn't even get any kind of a hearing at all in the press unless you adhered to Israeli talking points about the conflict. In recent years, however, that has slipped a bit, and part of that has to do with changing demographic nature of Jews in the United States, Jews in Europe and elsewhere that have forced conversations. I know when I was younger, the so-called birthright trip to Israel, which is this insane program that exists for American Jews to go and visit Israel as if Israel is their homeland or something. When I refused to participate in that on political grounds, it was like crazy. I didn't know of anybody who did that. This would have been like 2002, 3, 4 in that range. And even into 2005 and 6, I was still technically qualified to go because I was between 18 and 28 or whatever the age requirement was. This kind of propaganda was sort of solid and impenetrable for a long time. That is no longer the case. The videos of Israeli apartheid are all over TikTok and YouTube and other social media. The videos of Israeli soldiers gunning down Palestinian children, they've been viewed millions of times, and not just in the Arab world, but in the Western world. You have young Jews now openly standing up during the so-called birthright trips and challenging Israeli propaganda. The Israeli monopoly Israeli on information has slipped tremendously. And that's part of the issue here. Why the Israelis have to hammer so hard in the mainstream press, why they're so concerned about their standing internationally. It's because many, including the younger Jews that they would have historically relied on for support, many are turning away because they don't want to support this fascist apartheid state, just like me. Right. So this is really important as well. The Israelis are trying to spin all of these events of recent days to make themselves into the victims, because victimhood allows them to justify the unjustifiable campaign that they're about to wage. This is clear, unmistakable, plain as the nose on your face. Now, Israeli propaganda is in overdrive. We, of course, know about, the various information warfare, Hasbara, all the rest of this stuff. If you're a veteran of the left, none of this is new. But the intensity has really been turned up in recent days. And here I'm going to just quickly note, Counterpunch, our own website, has been attacked by unknown actors. All of a sudden, in recent days, DDoS attack, trying to take down Counterpunch, as Counterpunch publishes day after day after day articles critical of the Israelis, critical of the mainstream press, in defense of Palestinians, in defense of Palestine solidarity, etc. Counterpunch is now directly being attacked by unknown actors for, I would suggest, this precise coverage of these issues, just like what I'm saying to you here now. The last thing I just want to point out here is I'm almost at 30 minutes, so I'm sorry for the length of this, but there's so much to say and not enough time. The other issue that I want to highlight is how important this issue is for Jews in the United States and in the West, and really anywhere in the world. Jews have a particular responsibility here, a clear and unmistakable moral imperative to stand up and say no, to stand up and say, I do not support Israel. I do not support its misinformation and propaganda, and I will stand with Palestinians in solidarity against this genocidal campaign that the Israelis are planning to wage. The solidarity work in general right now is critical in all of its forms, but with a particular responsibility for Jews, especially those in the United States who have various means to try to influence policy that could potentially have an impact. This is now your time to stand up, to have the courage to stand up and say, not in my fucking name, not now, not ever. Palestinians deserve to be free, deserve to live their lives in peace, and this campaign of apartheid and genocide must be stopped now and forever. It is just that simple. And if you don't stand up and make such a statement or something along those lines, and not only show your solidarity with Palestinians, but encourage others in your family, in your social networks, and wherever to do the same. If you don't do that, you will not only have missed a historic opportunity, but you will have failed in your historic obligation here. It is 2023, and the fact that the Israelis and the Zionist propagandists want to use the Holocaust as a weapon for their own agendas, we have to stand up and say it is you attempting to perpetrate a Holocaust, and we say never again. It's all I can say for now before I get really emotional about all of this. Please go to Counterpunch, support Counterpunch, do what you can. So most importantly, forget Counterpunch for a moment. Support Gaza, support the people of Gaza, support the Palestinians however you can. It could be getting involved locally with groups that are organizing events, Palestine solidarity marches, whatever. It could be donating money. It could be donating your time. It could be any number of different things. I can't tell you what to do. All I can tell you is it is needed now more than ever, and now is the time to stand up for what is right and to be the person that you really think you are. Even if you're not feeling well, I'm not feeling well. I didn't even want to do anything on social media, but I feel this obligation that I cannot ignore. And I hope you won't. Solidarity with the people of Gaza and Palestine. Talk to you next time.